What kind of society have we created when we have dozens of trans children staging a die-in a desperate attempt to bring light to the many children already killed by the state? What kind of society have we created that not only permits such violence, but chooses to ignore the desperate pleas of tortured and dying children? That's what we'll be looking into today, going over the recent political action by Trans Kids Deserve Better. But first, a quick content warning for the following: transmisia, medical violence, psychological torture, democide, and suicide. If our work has helped you, please consider supporting us via Patreon so that we can keep the channel running. You can also help us by liking, commenting, and sharing our work on social media. Hi there, my name is Ethel Thurston, she, her, they, them, and we're here to talk about the recent die-in hosted by Trans Kids Deserve Better, why they're doing what they're doing, and how they've largely been ignored by the press. Trans Kids Deserve Better seems to have been founded in response to the UK government stripping trans youth of essential healthcare, including fully reversible and clinically tested puberty blockers back in May, after the invention and release of the CAS review back in April. Now, I say invention because this non-peer-reviewed report was just that, a fantasy. It not only lied about its own methodology, lied or was ignorant about basic endocrine research, and tried hiding Hilary Cass's conflict of interest going in, a conflict of interest the government boasted about selecting her specifically for, but multiple NHS whistleblowers later revealed that Hilary Cass had assisted the UK government in covering up no less than 16 child deaths caused as a result of an earlier, now overturned ban, likely because said deaths revealed the horror of both the report and the current ban. To really put that in perspective, considering that around 0.5% of the UK population is trans as of 2021 statistics, the same year as the original ban that killed 16 children, that makes said 16 deaths proportionally equivalent to more than 3,000 child deaths among cis people in the UK. That's the scale of the violence we're talking about. Point is, the then Tory government knew the violence inherent to what it was doing when it chose to strip trans youth of essential support, violence Wes Streeting and the Labour Party have chosen to maintain in spite of open protest. Trans Kids Deserve Better first struck out in July, during London Pride, with 2 children climbing the NHS England headquarters to begin a sit-in, unfurling a banner that read, quote, "We are not pawns for your politics," end quote. They were soon joined by other trans kids who sat up there for 4 days, raising awareness and just shy of £7,000, in spite of a mainstream media blackout, with the vast majority of the coverage coming from smaller or independent sources. One of the kids would later tell Queer AF that, quote, "A mantra that we had on the ledge was that it's safer up here than on the NHS waiting list for trans healthcare because people are dying," end quote. Then, in August, Trans Kids Deserve Better held a sit-in at the Department for Education, protesting policies that would not only forcibly out trans youth to their parents, putting them at high risk of domestic violence, but would also ban acknowledgement of gender identity in school, echoing the Section 28 of decades past. The proposed guidelines would also prevent schools from acknowledging trans girls and trans boys as boys, requiring children to legally transition before they could socially transition, whilst also declaring that they cannot legally transition until they're 18, cutting them off from the simplest form of gender affirmation. Then, back in October, Trans Kids Deserve Better snuck into the LGBT Alliance's hate conference, releasing thousands of crickets, shutting it down. The LGBT Alliance is a far-right hate group invented by predominantly allo-cishet people to pretend like their anti-trans bigotry isn't merely recycled homomisia. Not only do the LGBT Alliance have a sordid history of promoting anti-LGBT+ rhetoric, with its founders openly asserting that gay-inclusive schools would enable predatory gay teachers, but they have, themselves, actively sexualized children's bodies, specifically the bodies belonging to trans boys and adolescent AFAB folk.
Up and down the country and around the world, girls are removing breasts that have never known a lover's caress.
Trans boys, who Alison Bailey is sexualizing here whilst misgendering them, don't receive surgery as medical minors. All they're given are fully reversible puberty blockers that pause breast tissue growth. So Bailey has had to invent non-existent breast in order to lament how she and her fellow gender-critical fascists will never be able to grope them, all as a means of motivating said gender-critical fascists to strip said trans youth of any and all bodily autonomy, effectively turning them into sexual stock, which they can then groom before handing out as rewards for people who serve their cause, a behaviour that former members of said ideology have attested to. The conference was, of course, rather famously attended and supported by none other than gender-critical leader J.K. Rowling, also a personal friend of Bailey, the woman we just heard sexualizing minors. The photo on screen was taken the year after Bailey gave that speech. We covered the cricket story at the time, having finally re-established myself after a long few months. We also followed up with a video sharing the personal testimonies of the trans youth involved in said action, the self-described crickets. We did so since, whilst this action gained far more attention than their previous protest, going viral, most of said attention focused purely on the action itself, erasing the motivations behind it whilst taking the LGBT Alliance's assertions to speak for the LGBT communities at face value. All money from the testimony video was donated to the Crickets legal fundraiser. Whilst we're on the topic of the Crickets, it's worth mentioning that another gender-critical leader, Graham Linehan, 56, began stalking Sophia, a 17-year-old trans girl who may be one of the Crickets, with Linehan fishing for Sophia's private information including college and address. Video then surfaced of Linehan approaching said 17-year-old in the street at night, screaming at her about sissy porn, trying to sexually degrade her before physically assaulting her. Linehan managed to grab her phone and chuck it against the floor, likely in a bid to destroy said evidence. Thankfully he failed, because of course he did, but I do think this incident is worth bringing up to highlight the violence being targeted at trans kids by gender-critical leaders. I think it shows just how afraid gender-critical fascists are of these kids standing up and reclaiming their voices. And that brings us up to date on who trans kids deserve better are and what they've done. They've already had a marked impact, in spite of only being formed this year and most mainstream media refusing to report on their protests. Which brings us to today's topic and how, in response to Wes Streeting renewing the ban on puberty blockers, 16 trans youth staged a die-in at Victoria Station on the 27th of November. Trans kids deserve better then took to Reddit the next day, sharing photos of their actions along with a comment that, quote, "Today is the first day of the renewal of Wes Streeting's ban on hormone blockers. Last night 16 of us staged a die-in because this government doesn't listen before we're dead." The cast review is a work of political pseudoscience, arguing that self-expression is dangerous and puberty blockers are somehow dangerous, but only if the person using them is trans. Wes Streeting and the Department for Health and Social Care are knowingly putting the lives and well-being of trans kids all over the country at risk and hiding behind the US election so nobody would notice them do it. We don't deserve to be treated like this. We deserve better. We staged a die-in at Victoria Station near the Department of Health and Social Care to protest the recent extension of the puberty blocker ban." End quote. They then linked a more thorough statement which stated that, quote, 16 young trans activists from Trans Kids Deserve Better staged a die-in in Victoria Station near the Department for Health and Social Care to protest the recent extension of the puberty blocker ban. They used headstones detailing something important to each of them in order to stress that trans people are real individuals whose lives and healthcare should not be politicized. The activists then walked these to the Department for Health and Social Care and left them outside. The activists aim to bring attention to the actions of Health Secretary Wes Streeting in relation to healthcare for young trans people and urge him to realize the damaging effects of his actions, which he has repeatedly ignored. The day marks the deadline for Wes Streeting to extend his temporary ban on puberty blockers. However, he did this instead on the 6th of November, just days after meeting with trans children whose well-being would be greatly affected by this. Streeting shows a clear lack of regard for trans children, and his actions can no longer be defended by naivety. The puberty blocker ban outlaws the prescription of puberty blockers for trans children, citing a perceived lack of evidence that they are safe and effective based on the widely denounced and unscientific Cass review. It does not outlaw their prescription for cis children experiencing precocious or early onset puberty. This is yet another example of the systemic denial of trans people's dignity, autonomy, and voice in healthcare. For months, Trans Kids Deserve Better has been asking for a meeting with Wes Streeting in order to show him who his actions are affecting and properly inform him of the consequences. Puberty blockers give trans children the chance to grow up in a body that they are comfortable in and are life-saving. Kids can't be kids if they're dead, read the activist banner. In a speech outside of the Department of Health and Social Care during the action, one of the activists said, "Today, the extension of the puberty blocker ban comes into force. This cruel decision was made by Health Secretary Wes Streeting, despite having met with trans youth and their families in this very building. During that meeting, Wes Streeting heard these kids' stories and the devastating impact a ban would have on their lives and mental health, yet he heartlessly chose to go ahead with the extension. Trans kids are being bullied by our government under the guise of the flawed and biased Cass review. But we continue to resist through our very existence. We are standing out here today because we should not have to die for people to start listening. We are standing out here today as a reminder of the strength and hope that flows through our community. We are standing out here today because bans on gender-affirming care are not letting kids be kids, they're killing them." End quote. A very powerful statement, leaving absolutely zero deniability on this topic. The fact that this dying consisted of 16 children, the same number of children known to have been killed following the 2021 ban, is very symbolic. Back when the NHS whistleblowers came forward, there was a degree of deniability offered to the newly elected Labour Party since they hadn't been in office at the time. It had been the Tory Health Secretary, Victoria Atkins, who had been approached along with Hilary Cass herself. But in the months since Labour took power, I and various others have covered the Tavistock 16, the 16 children murdered by the state's actions in 2021, ensuring that this news got out there, yet some people still like to defend Labour, declaring that they simply didn't know. So to add to that, the confirmation that Trans Kids Deserve Better held a meeting with Wes Streeting to discuss this very harm, only for Streeting to go ahead and renew said deadly ban, is definitive. Ignorance is no longer an excuse, if it ever was. Wes Streeting and the wider Labour Party are knowingly and willingly engaged in action that has already killed 16 trans children and is going to kill more. Any defense for Labour at this point is supporting the ongoing democide of trans children. Sadly, for as brave as these children were, mainstream media outlets have refused to listen. At the time of writing this on the 4th of December, a whole week after the protest took place, I only found 4 articles covering the action. One on Pink News, one on G-Scene, one on Them, and one on LGBTQ Nation, all 4 of which are specialist LGBT+ outlets. The only other articles I could find were mirrors of said articles on sites such as MSN, and that's it. That's all of them. That's why it was so important to publish this video, to make as many people aware of the protest and why it took place, as well as the significance of it being 16 children, since none of the 4 articles even mention the Tavistock 16. Point is, if the mainstream media are going to instill a blackout on the known deaths of 16 trans children as a result of government policies which has since been brought back and renewed, it is our duty as adults within the LGBT+ community to make as much noise as we can. It is also our duty to acknowledge the violence being carried out here in how trans youth are being stripped of their voices and autonomy. Ignoring the screams of trans children as their friends are being killed by the state is not a neutral act. It is an act that sides with said state violence that enables it to take place. Every institution with the resources to cover this that fails to do so is complicit in said democide. I don't think it's a wild notion to suggest that it is a journalist's duty to report on state-sanctioned child murder, and yet, I seem to be practically alone in doing so. Sadly, this sort of violence is par for the course when it comes to gender-critical fascists. They routinely strip trans youth of their right to autonomy, right to personal identity, and right to privacy. We saw this in the Department for Education's proposals to out trans youth to their parents, a move that achieves nothing but endangering children who very clearly don't feel safe coming out at home. It opens said children up, not just to emotional, physical, and sexual violence, but homelessness, with 24% of all homeless youth in the UK being LGBT+, in large part due to family rejection. We also saw this in that horrific clip in which Alison Bailey lamented the fact that AFAB trans folk were using their bodily autonomy to pause breast tissue growth until they were older. Not only did Alison Bailey invent non-existent breasts in pretending like children are receiving surgery to remove them, but her primary argument against said removal was that other people, such as herself, had yet to get sexual satisfaction from groping said phantom breasts, reminder that she was very explicitly singling out children in her horrific tirade. She gave absolutely zero regard to the autonomy of said children, instead reducing them down to nothing more than an object of sexual desire, a passive entity to be acted upon by others. Many of the trans men who have spoken out in the comments of our videos after seeing that clip were very clear in that they didn't want to be groped that way, not now, not as a child, and it is disgusting for people like Bailey to force themselves and their desires upon trans youth. That is why it is so important to amplify the voices of these children as the people impacted. Because there's a reason gender-critical fascists fight so hard to erase said voices. And that's the fact that gender-critical fascism is largely unpopular. Not only are cis women more likely to be supportive of trans rights than cis men, but cis lesbians and cis bisexual women, the primary demographic gender-critical fascism pretends to fight for, are the most supportive LGBT+ demographic when it comes to the rights of trans people, with 96% of said cis women supporting trans rights. This puts gender-critical fascism at a distinct disadvantage. It doesn't have the popular support it needs, so it has to manufacture consent to justify its atrocities. And the way it does this is by controlling the narrative, which includes silencing the voices of its victims, namely the very children it is currently set on murdering. Because as much as they like to cry, "Let kids be kids," gender-critical fascists are the one endangering said children's lives, reducing them down to sex slaves, psychologically torturing them to the point that they've had to radicalize themselves, forcing said children to put themselves on the front line in a culture war in which they are being assaulted in the streets by gender-critical predators, because the alternative is death. That's the life these kids have been forced into by gender-critical fascists, which is why their cries of "let kids be kids" are so ghoulish. If this is what they think being a kid should be, then that says a lot about them and how they perceive children in general. Which is why this bullshit needs to be tackled head on. If you're on the ground, find out how you can get involved, even if it's just to turn up and watch over said children as they protest, using yourself as a shield against the direct forms of violence gender-critical fascists have openly resorted to. Otherwise, get the word out, share their statements and testimonies, make sure that as many people know about their actions and motives as possible, and don't let the current government bury this with the support of the UK press. We have the power to hold them accountable if we choose to. Because that's what it is at this point, a choice. You either do what you can or you're complicit. There is no middle ground. It was killed alongside those 16 children. Though, what do you think? What are your thoughts on the die-in? What other ways can you think of to help these children? How do we begin to hold the UK government responsible for the murder of trans children? Did you notice something I missed? If so, be sure to let me know in the comments down below. And if you appreciate what we do here and want to help keep us running, please consider becoming one of the wonderful patrons who make our work possible. You can also make a one-time donation via PayPal or Super Thanks on YouTube. On that note, we'd just like to thank the following people: Matthew Kovac, Hannah Banghart, Goddess the Lighter, Soshula, Way on 6 Denials, Flynn, and Higgins the Seagull. And for myself, Adita and Levi, take care now.